The last presidential debate, did it make a difference? Plus the damaging charges of voter fraud and a rigged election. How will that affect turnout and trust? Also coming up, the Michigan GOP divided. We're also talking high-level players in the Flint water investigation and a cautious return to home demo in Detroit. Stay right there. Nolan and Stephen are here, and MiWeek starts right now.
Business Leaders for Michigan, a supporter of Detroit Public Television, announces their 5th annual Michigan CEO Summit on November 10th at the Westin Book Cadillac. Learn and share proven ideas and inspiration on business, the digital marketplace, and Michigan's economic growth with top executives. A great lineup of speakers, networking opportunities, and creative inspiration. For more information on the Business Leaders for Michigan CEO Summit, go to businessleadersformichigan.com/events. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Hi and welcome to MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. So the last debate is finally over, a nasty battle between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton that did bring out some substance in the beginning, but what has many of us talking is the idea that Trump may not accept election results, and that just goes with his charges of a rigged election. We will talk about the potential damaging effect of this, and it won't just be politics tonight. We're taking a look at a few new things in the Flint water investigation and home demos starting back up again in Detroit. But let's get to it with our MiWeek contributors. Nolan Finley, the editorial page editor of the Detroit News, and Stephen Henderson, the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. Full titles today, guys. How about that, huh? Look at that. Something special. All right. So the debate is finally over. I'm glad. I think
all of them are over.
All of them are over. And I think I would have to say that I am with the part of America who has felt very anxious to the run-up of the election, the run-up of seeing these debates. And I thought for the first 30 minutes of this debate that we actually got some substance out of both candidates, and I was very pleased. And then it went off the rails. Nolan, I'm going to start with you with where you think. Well, first, let's start off positive. Let's start with the substance. What'd you think?
I mean, I kept watching my watch, thinking, okay, we're 25 minutes in, no interruptions. We're 30 minutes in, no interruptions. You can start to contrast these candidates on their positions, and they are obviously have very distinct positions, and we hadn't heard much of that to this point. They were sticking to the missions they had. Trump needed to look presidential, and he was, and Hillary Clinton needed to finally tell people what her vision was. She needed to do something other than say, "I'm not Donald Trump," and she was doing that. And then, boom, all of a sudden, she poked him once and poked him twice, and he went, poof.
Yeah, and you know what? The two places it was when she said that he choked when he talked to the Mexican president, and that he said he was a puppet.
You're a puppet.
And exactly, but you can tell it was the thin-skinned Donald Trump that all of a sudden it just lit him there.
That's been her strategy the whole time, is to essentially lay all of these little traps for him all over the floor. And wait for him to go stick his finger in each one. And what he's done in all three debates is make sure that he steps in or puts his finger in each one of them, right? Don't miss one. Don't stay on message for anything. And so last night, the same thing happened to him. I mean, he's just unable to resist the idea that he's got to answer every little...
Or that anyone could perceive him as being weak. That's what it is. That's what he's prickly about.
He's like a little boy, you get him all dressed up and say, now, let's keep these clothes straight into the school picture, and you could see him up there trying so hard, and then, whoosh, everything goes to heck.
Tie around back.
What did you make of the Supreme Court conversation? Because I got a lot out of that.
I thought it could have been better on both sides. So Hillary Clinton is... A lawyer, B, somebody who's been in Washington for a long time, knows a lot about the Supreme Court, has seen, she's not on the Judiciary Committee, but she's seen several confirmation hearings and things like that. I thought she could have given a more sort of expert level answer to the way that she sees the Constitution, the way that she sees appointing justice. I thought that her answers were fine, but they didn't reflect the depth that I know she has to offer on that question. And so I wondered what was sort of going on there. Like, was she trying to tailor it to an audience that maybe is not as into it as she is? But I thought she missed an opportunity there. I thought his answer was absurd. I mean, he doesn't understand the Constitution. He doesn't know it, and he's released this list of judges, some of whom are probably acceptable candidates, some of whom are not. But he doesn't have any real clear vision of what the court's role is, and what kind of people he should be appointing to it to sort of further that role.
What did you make of the answers?
Well, I
Nolan?
think she was playing safe on that question, as many others. She wasn't going to go out and acknowledge she envisions this as an activist court. I thought he handled the question fine for the people he was talking to. He said he'd appoint strict constructionists, and that's what his list is made up of. And if you look at sort of the straw a lot of Republicans are grasping at when they say they still support Donald Trump, it's because he'll appoint better Supreme Court justices. And I think he was speaking to that constituency with that answer.
I think I want to get to that larger questions of how Republicans trust that he would actually carry out any of the things that he's talked to. I want to get to that in just a little bit. But I do want to get to, I think, what the largest thing that has come out of this debate is the fact that when he was asked directly about will you accept the results of this election, that he said, we'll see. And then it was essentially like, I don't know. And then it was like, stay tuned, like I'm keeping you in suspense, like it's some kind of game, which is what many people have said from every side of every side of the process, that this is a dangerous thing for him to say and even put into question. But this is something that he's been doing on the campaign trail now for the last week and a half, that this election has been rigged. Stephen, I'm going to let you take a tack at this first.
Well, I mean, it should be a disqualifier, I think, for the office. I mean, not a legal disqualifier, but a moral one. The idea that you are bigger than the process, the idea that your election or your sense of things is bigger than the country. I mean, and that relates to a lot of other things where Donald Trump seems to misunderstand the role of the president, the role of elections in this country. I also want to tie, though, what he's saying to the Republican Party itself and the questioning that it has pursued about this voter fraud myth that perpetrates over and over again. I mean, every single study shows that the margin of error in terms of voter fraud is so slim as to not matter at all, and yet we have this constant sort of story being told about, well, there's all these people on the voting rolls who can't vote, and somehow that should cast doubt on the election, or there's people who vote twice. This is not terribly far from what Donald Trump is saying. He's saying something much worse. He's taking it to an extreme that's an actual threat, I think, to the country. But it's not detached wholly from what Republicans are saying anyway.
Who does that impact most of all?
Well, I mean, I would agree that this, and I wrote this morning, this is a disqualifier. All these folks who have been on my back for not embracing Donald Trump and saying he'll stand up for the Constitution. Well, he proved last night that he has no fealty to the foundations of this country, and that is a core principle, that you accept the results and move on. We've always done it. These people who say, well, Gore and Bush didn't do it, they certainly did when the results were known. That was a long time before the results were known. He said he may not accept the results because of the manner in which we got to that. And to me, that's un-American. It's unacceptable. It disqualifies him for this office. I don't know what's left for people now. I mean, if you say he'll appoint Supreme Court justice who will honor the Constitution, how can you be certain if he won't? If he's not going to honor the Constitution or honor our core values and core principles. We've never had a president say that. As for voter fraud, I think voter fraud is probably not as rampant as Republicans make out, and probably more so than Democrats want us to believe. I think we ought to be able to protect the integrity of the vote without breaking into these partisan fights. They're simple steps we should take to ensure only people who are eligible to vote. I think you can do that without disenfranchising people. But I think making this such a divisive political issue will never get to the point where people have confidence.
But the people who are making it a partisan issue are Republicans. Republican legislatures in states all over the country are trying to disenfranchise African American voters. There's no question about that. The Supreme Court showed, or the appeals court for the Fourth Circuit showed that in North Carolina, Republican legislators looked at how the laws that they were thinking about enacting would affect different kinds of voters. They went through, they chose the ones that would disenfranchise more African Americans. What's happening in North Carolina is what's happening across the South, which is that African Americans for the first time are starting to exercise their right to vote. That's changing those states. North Carolina went for Barack Obama in 2008. It almost went in 2012. It may go for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Republicans are panicking because they're losing control of those states,
But-
and they are.
So-
But on the other side of this-
and so it's all predicated on this myth of fraud. It's not. It's not disconnected. There's no ambiguity here about what they're doing or why.
So you say this is disenfranchising certain voters, but could Donald Trump's assertion of a rigged election also make his voters not turn out, saying, well, it doesn't matter if I vote or not anyway, the whole thing is a fix?
I think the danger here on what we've heard about rigged election is, that you break down trust, whether people vote or not. You break down trust in the institutions. I think similarly, what we're reading in these emails with all the underhanded and techniques and corner cutting and the stuff John Podesta has been putting out about certain groups and what have you, that breaks down trust in the institution. Neither one of these candidates have helped restore America's faith in their country and in its systems. And the press, I think, has done its role in hurting that to this election.
How so?
This has been a very
How do you think the
damaging
press
election.
How do you think the press
Well, I
has
think
had a
the
role?
press has not remained as objective as it should be. We've had too many examples now of collusion between the press and the Clinton campaign, and people now are losing trust in us as watchdogs. I think this has been a very damaging election to the American institutions, and I think you can blame the personalities.
So I think that also then goes back to the larger question that we were talking about, is it's kind of all woven into like what happens the day after the election. And when you talk about people and Donald Trump saying, well, I don't know if I'm going to accept the results, you hear people saying it's going to lead some kind of revolution or something like that. It's unsettling, and it makes you say, well, then no one trusts anything at the end of all of this, and how do you recover from that?
Well, I mean, I think again, there are people who benefit from the cynicism, right? And there are parties in this country who have used that cynicism to their advantage for a really long time. I mean, none of this is in and of itself new. Think of how cynical the move, for instance, in 1988 was to trot out Willie Horton in the last hours of that campaign to try to scare white voters off of voting for Mike Dukakis. That's not fundamentally different from what we're dealing now. It's a matter of degree. We've been headed in this direction for a really long time, and Democrats have had their instances of exploiting that cynicism as well. I think both parties would do well in the next few years to try to reset and come up with better ways to attract voters to their side. But how optimistic am I of that happening? I mean, come on.
New parties.
How do you
Or
do
new
that?
parties, I suppose that's also
Yeah.
possible.
But you can also have to turn this question around. How many Democrats do you think would accept Trump if he does happen to pull off a miracle and prevail on election
Well,
day?
but
You've got
as
all of
Democrats,
this
we've
fear mongering that he's going to be this, that, and the other thing, and disagree or not. How many of them would on election day say, he's my president?
But we've seen Democrats have to do that. I mean, in 2000, Al Gore won the popular vote in Florida. We know that now after the fact. Most Democrats knew that then, understood that this was a disenfranchisement of some voters in order to make George Bush the president. You didn't see people sitting around re-prosecuting that over and over, or saying we don't accept the
So
outcome
what would you say is the
No,
difference
nor
between
did
what
you
would
in
you say is the
1960.
Or in
difference? What would
1960.
you say is the difference between now and then?
We're more
16
divided
years
people.
out.
I think we are more divided, and I think there is more. I mean, we've been through a lot since then. 9/11, for starters, which happens within a year of that election. The recession, which really, I think, calls on us to recognize some of the things that we've done wrong over a long period of time in terms of shifting the definition of work and economic security in this country. I mean,
success.
people feel vulnerable legitimately and want better answers. What we have, though, is a demagogue sort of exploiting that vulnerability and pushing them toward an extreme and scapegoating, which is not the way to get
There's also been the aloofness of Washington to the people. You've got two parties there who are more worried about protecting their advantages, their political power, than they are about listening to the people.
I don't think that's
and
new.
a lot of folks, I think it's accelerated over the last several years. You have a lot of people out there thinking nobody's listening to me. Nobody is connected to my values, my concerns. You all are doing what you want to do to appease to this group or that group, but in terms of the broader people, nobody's speaking to us, nobody's representing us. I think that explained Bernie Sanders. I think it explained Donald Trump, this idea that we don't trust you in Washington. You've been so dysfunctional for so long. You haven't done the things you said you'd do when we sent you there. I think that's the underlying theme in this whole election.
It's the underlying theme, but unfortunately, I believe, though, that after this election, it's only going to get worse. There's only going to entrench people in the sand in terms of, well, my guy didn't win or my person didn't win.
It doesn't have to. You're already seeing, though, this, and John McCain is as Republicans go, one of the more reasonable, experienced, sane protectors of governance. And we saw him this week come out and say, well, it's not going to matter what happens in the election. If we hold the Senate, we're not going to confirm any Supreme Court justices that Hillary Clinton
That makes everybody
puts up.
throw up their
When
hands.
John McCain is saying that, there's a real problem. I mean, you're not going to, and he's saying it for political purposes. He's trying to raise voter turnout, I think, in Arizona, where he may be in some trouble.
He is in trouble.
And that state may be in trouble for Republicans. But it's a cynical approach to trying to hold on to power. And as long as you do that, it's hard then to turn around and say, well, let's all work together and find common ground and common interest.
But you had Grassley immediately come out and disavow that. I think there's
Which
a
I
lot
thought
of
he
good
deserved a lot of
people.
credit for that.
I think that Republicans are going to lose the White House, probably going to lose the Senate. I think it's very important then that they hold the House if we're going to hold the country together, because you can't have this wide swath of Americans feeling like things are going to get jammed down their throat because they've got no voice in Washington. I think Paul Ryan's a guy who could work with Hillary Clinton, could check her over-ambitious items and her overreach, but could also be willing to work with her on important things that need to get done. I think you could see some progress in that scenario if Republicans will line up behind Paul Ryan, and that's a big if.
That's a big if. All right, one thing I want to mention quickly before we leave politics. Really interesting little upheaval in the Michigan Republican Party this week. Grassroots Vice Chair Wendy Day was ousted from her post this week for publicly not supporting Donald Trump. State Party Chair Ronna Romney McDaniel made the move, saying bylaws state if a party leader isn't supporting the ticket, they're out. What did you guys make of this move this week? I'm going to start with you, Stephen.
I actually talked to Wendy Day about this yesterday, I guess, and it's a strange move. This is not a Republican on the fence. She's not
She's a fire breather.
I mean, this is a very vociferously conservative Republican, and so to push her out because she says, and I think she has really great reasons for saying, she doesn't think that Donald Trump represents the Republican Party. I think that's a reasonable position.
And if Nolan had about 30 minutes, he'd be able to give
and
you,
she's
I'm sure,
working
a whole
for the
speech
party.
on that.
She's out
But that's what the
registering
bylaws
voters
say.
and getting people.
I mean, that's what the rules say. The
but
rules say
it's never happened before.
We've never had a case where somebody's done that. I think Ronna had her hands tied. It never happened. It's never happened before, but you've never had someone go this direction. She had to do it, but I think this speaks to the reason Republicans were doomed from the beginning with this nominee, and maybe even before. You went into this election with an extremely divided party. They fought each other over the last 4 years far more than they fought Barack Obama, and I believe they would have taken the White House in 2012 if they could have stopped this internecine war that started almost immediately as they took Congress in 2010. And so they went into this divided, they went into this fighting, and this is just another symptom of it.
I think it's interesting because you and I are talking a little bit about this. Is this larger question of Republicans saying, well, you have to follow him because he's at the top of the ticket and because of the Supreme Court issues that come into and what he could appoint. And it does speak to something that you mentioned a little bit earlier of, can you really trust what Donald Trump would do? And seeing as he's gone after a lot of members of the Republican Party, could you really trust that he's going to carry out exactly the agenda that the Republicans want? All right, I'm going to move on a little bit more now, taking a look at the continuing investigation into the Flint water crisis. The state's health department director is now a target of the criminal probe into the lead-contaminated drinking water situation. Although Nick Lyon hasn't been formally charged, he did get subpoenaed to turn over documents related to the city's switch to the Flint water for its water supply. And meanwhile, the ACLU has filed a class action lawsuit accusing education officials of not providing required services for the Flint children exposed to lead. And the third thing to come out this week is this bipartisan report taking a look at the crisis and zeroing in on some of the changes that should be made and how the state handles things coming out of this. And the one thing that people are really talking about is emergency management, that maybe it shouldn't be just one person and making those health decisions because of monetary issues, but maybe there should be a three-person panel. Nolan, I'm going to let you take a crack at this.
We haven't seen a new emergency manager appointed since Flint, I don't think. I'm not sure we're ever going to see one again. I don't know why anybody would take that job. I mean, it's a no-win job. You know, whether three people would do better than one person. It's the idea of, you know, taking over these communities and dismissing the local officials that I think is what has caused so much conflict in this. I don't know if that's any better if it's three or it's one. You know, maybe it's a bigger mess. Maybe it's less efficient.
Well, it's a bigger check. I mean, it's a greater number of minds to sort of think through.
I thought you meant
some of these problems. Oh,
bigger cost.
It's also that too, right? It costs you more. I mean, the report has a lot of suggestions in it. Some of them I think make a lot of sense. Some of them I'm not sure address the actual problems.
Like what? What stuck out to you?
So, I mean, again, the issue is actually not the law itself. It's the law in absence of greater funding for local governments. I mean, the truth is that local governments don't have enough to survive. They just don't. You can talk to mayors or township supervisors all over the state about that, and they will all talk about how much less they have now than they used to have to provide basic services.
And why is that?
There are a number of reasons. Part of it is we've taken $6 billion out of revenue sharing since 2000. $6 billion. All of that money, if it's back in city coffers, prevents the Detroit bankruptcy. It prevents all the stuff we've seen in Flint, things like that. We also, of course, have all these legacy costs that we haven't reckoned with how to pay for.
60% of most municipal budgets.
Of a lot of them.
Unsustainable.
I mean, so it is unsustainable as long as they don't have the money. Think about it. We had those benefits for years and years and years, and cities weren't in trouble.
Yeah,
they're
but
only
you didn't
in trouble
have the
now.
number of people. I mean, it's a cumulative
We've
thing.
we've let people retire probably too early. People are living longer than they used to, and so you've got to adjust to try to deal with that. My answer is to come up with the money to make sure that people who serve in municipal positions for their careers have decent retirement benefits. I think other people would say get rid of the benefits or reduce them significantly so that there's
match them to the private sector who are paying the bills.
Well, there are a lot of different options. The point is we're not talking about any of them in any sort of earnest way. And so we nickel and dime with, well, let's change emergency management so it looks a little different to people at the local level, but really you're not getting a substantive difference because their cities will continue to be.
But it's worked in some places, Christy. I mean,
it has worked in some places.
Kevin Orr didn't need two other people. I mean,
well, you had
wouldn't you say
50
that's a
other
different? That was a
people.
bit of a different situation,
you
though.
know, you've had emergency managers do good work in other places.
Benton Harbor,
I think the key is
Allen Park.
One of the problems we had, I don't think we gave these folks enough training, enough support, enough help from. I mean, the state's got this large, bureaucracy and all these experts and all these departments, and I don't think they deployed them fully enough in support of these emergency managers. You can't just throw them in there and say fix it. I think you've got to keep an eye on them, but you've also got to help them and support them. I've heard emergency managers say, we feel like they forgot about us here.
And do you really think that that's the last emergency management that we'll see?
I can't see. In that structure, I think the Wayne County structure is more likely.
Big consent.
And you notice that they came out from under their consent agreement today. That worked perfectly. And so the law has some benefits.
Well, it didn't work perfectly because Warren Evans will say, and he said on this show, this is about trying to make do with what we have, and that's not good enough. He doesn't have enough to do the things that he needs to do to provide services in the county. He needs more money.
Yeah. All right. Well, we were going to get to the demolition issue in the city of Detroit. We're going to have to get to that next time. Thanks so much, guys. We ran out of time. It's just too good. That is going to do it for I don't know. It happens all the time. It's going to do it for MiWeek. Make sure you catch up with us on MiWeek.org. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We are there. I'm Christy McDonald. For all of us at Detroit Public Television, thanks so much for watching, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Did you know Roush Enterprises was selected by Google to assemble a test fleet of 100 prototype self-driving cars in 2015? It also produced the new Domino's delivery cars. And speaking of Domino's, Domino's sells well over 2 million pizzas per day around the world, and half of their sales are digital. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.